Welcome to Just One Q. I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, a diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate. In this podcast, I chat with industry experts and thought leaders about the latest trends related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Each episode, I ask just one question tied to current events. The goal is to leave you with the tools that you need to drive change in your own life, both personally and professionally. It's common to hear leaders say, I want to create a workplace culture where employees feel like they can bring their full selves to work. But beyond being a nice thing to say or a goal to aspire to, what does bringing your full self to work actually look like? And if leaders aspire to make this statement come true, what needs to happen in our workplaces for employees to actually feel like they can bring their full selves to work? So for today's question, I'm asking, is it realistic to say that employees can really bring their full selves to work? And to answer today's question, I'm excited to be joined by Ymani Hawkins. Ymani, thank you so much for joining me today.
Really excited to be here. Thank you, Melissa.
So just a bit about Ymani. She holds a Master of Social Work from the Silver School of Social Work at NYU. She's a diversity and mental wellness coach who marries mental wellness techniques, psychological principles, and evidence-based therapies with DEI best practices. As the founder of the consultancy Deepish, Ymani addresses implicit biases, microaggressions, racial trauma, racial battle fatigue, and psychological unsafety via self-care awareness, emotional intelligence strategies, and mindfulness techniques. Ymani's insights have been shared with business, arts, and media sectors, as well as religious institutions and nonprofits. So, Ymani, I want to dig into this because I know you have a lot to say about this topic, but tell me about the idea that we could bring our full selves to work. Is this possible?
For sure. I think that's a really big question to ask. And I think it's easier for some folks to answer it than others. I think when we talk about the full self, we really have to capture what that means. What is the full self? I think traditionally in the workplace, to talk about neurodivergence, to talk about identity, intersectionality, race, culture has been a little challenging and often stigmatized. And I think now that we're moving towards an equitable, accessible, and socially just world, especially in the workplace, then it's important that this conversation is had, right? And so when we talk about the full self, I think now we're having conversations about identity in terms of our demographics, sexual orientation, gender, race, ethnicity, culture, et cetera. Some of these things, age. But I think we have to dig a little deeper and actually look at what it looks like for different intersectionalities and different identities. So for instance, what is your attachment style? What is your love language? What is your personality type? What's your leadership style? What are your gifts, talents, your strengths, etc.? And I think some of these things kind of play a role into how we even show up in the space that we're in. And then also when we take into account some of the additional work that folks have to do to be their full selves, I think it makes the conversation a little tricky, right? Because for one specific person to show up as their full self might be accepted, celebrated, valued, seen, right? And another might be seen as disruptive or obnoxious or not appropriate for the workplace, right? And so I think when we ask this question, we have to take into consideration all of the things that make a person in order for them to be their full self.
So if you're a leader and you've got a number of different employees on your team, how do you encourage, or what do leaders need to do or start thinking about to be able to create a space where folks can actually feel comfortable digging deeper, right? A lot of folks are still not out in many ways in the workplace, right? They are not out in terms of their gender identity or expression. They're not out in terms of the people they love. A lot of folks who are neurodiverse may not be out about that in the workplace as well. And you mentioned sort of this intersectionality in sort of the various ways that our identity affects how we show up to work. What do leaders have to start to signal? Like what is it that sort of creates the place where people say, okay, I can let you know a bit more about me? And do we want to do that?
I love this question. So I think there are a couple of things that come to mind when answering this question. I think the first thing is modeling. I think for any skill that you want to incorporate, instill in an organization, it should be exemplified first. And so if leaders want to see their employees engage in vulnerability, cultural humility, engage in these difficult conversations, then they themselves have to exemplify what that looks like. And to do this, I think one, like I said, cultural humility is very important. This understanding that we will never know everything, no matter how many trainings we do, no matter how many DI ideas, conversations that we have, we will never know everything. And I think it's important that we glean from that and we lean into our employees and from each other to gain different perspectives, to learn into each other or play into each other's strengths and learn about each other's backgrounds and cultural contexts. Something that I do in addition to Deepish is work for ideas generation, ideas standing for inclusion, diversity, equity, access, and social justice. And something that we do in our internal team is ask difficult questions or check-in questions or vulnerable questions at the beginning of every meeting to cultivate a culture of vulnerability, belonging, understanding. One of those questions look like, what is your relationship with money, right? Or what are your love languages? And how can that kind of translate into the workplace, right? And if I'm having a particular love language that is words of affirmation, that's my love language, but you're only giving me acts of service, then I'm not going to feel valued. I'm not going to feel like I belong in the specific arena because we're not speaking the same language in this case. And so I think to have these conversations beneath the surface is important. Brene Brown, who I absolutely love, talks about skilling up when we are talking about vulnerability in the workplace. And I think if we're going to say, hey, show up as your full self, do all the things, then we have to show that and we have to describe what that looks like. And we have to encourage folks to adopt some of the things that we're talking about, which is mutuality or this give and take process of learning. Or Timothy Clark talks about the 4 stages of psychological safety. And the first one is inclusion safety, just the ability for someone to come into the workplace, feel like they are seen, heard, and valued. And how do we do that? I think that is the golden question. And we do this through conversation. We do this through rapport building, through relationship building. It's going to be hard for me to talk to anybody about who I am if I don't know you, right? And so I think that's super important. And I think you asked another question at the end about, is this even possible? I would say it's possible because I see it done and I try to instill those principles in organizations through coaching and through workshops and through training. And then also with the other organization I work for, Ideas Generation, we exemplify that and we try to embody that to the best of our ability. And I think it made our team stronger by continually engaging in these difficult, challenging, vulnerable conversations. But the more that we practice them, the more we peel back the layers and we see how human we are and we see our humanity. And I think that is what we're getting at. We spend a lot of our time in the workplace, and it would feel really good if we can be seen and be valued and heard in the space that we're in. So I would definitely say that.
I think that's really interesting. I've been reading, though, that on the flip side of the shift to remote work, that a lot of racialized employees are saying, I don't want to go back to the office. I want to be able to, I can be my full self at home. I don't need to, be on camera, and the mental health benefits of being able to be at home and be my full self at work, but at home is something that I've been reading a lot about. And I think we want our workplaces to be safe, but and places where people can show up. And what we're hearing is that a lot of folks are saying like, yeah, I want to stay home because I can't be my full self at work, but I can at home. What do you have to say about that?
I think that is super valid. And a lot of my work involves going into ERG group spaces or coaching with individuals who are experiencing inequity, who are experiencing racial battle fatigue, who are experiencing emotional labor and code switching, and some of these things that folks of color experience in the workplace, because it's very challenging to be their full selves in the workplace. And so I would say that mental health is something that I always prioritize, and I would never encourage anyone to do something that puts them in harm's way or further pushes them outside of their comfort zone. And so there is that. And I think to that point, racial trauma is kind of these repetitive, cumulative traumatic effects that are displayed in the workplace, similar to PTSD, and it results from experiences of overt racism, as well as accumulation of everyday microaggressions. And taking that into account, it is completely understandable why folks are depleted, why they're exhausted, why they're burned out, and why even showing up in the workplace is detrimental, or having to explain to other people why they can't is detrimental, right?
Yeah.
And so I think an acknowledgement, again, just bringing it back to the culture of the organization is important. If we are constantly engaging in conversations about what vulnerability looks like, what emotional labor even is, what code switching is, the different entry points or access points for people to even meet on this concept of being our full selves in the workplace, I think we can start to dismantle some of this a little bit, but it starts with the culture. I have conversations with different generations about this conversation. It's very interesting to see how older generations are not really comfortable with this concept because
Mm.
talking about mental wellness, talking about identity and just vulnerability and transparency in the workplace is not for the workplace. That's not a conversation for this space. But I think we're moving towards, as we're talking about neurodivergence and accessibility, that it's quite important that we see and value everyone. Because currently we hear culture fit versus culture add. There is a culture that does exist, right? And what we're trying to do is dismantle it to create points of entry for everyone to contribute and feel like they can invest their time, their energy, their capacity in the work. So I would say that those are my initial thoughts on what you said. I'm wondering your thoughts about that.
Oh, wow. You're flipping the script on that. I often wonder, like, what is the work that leaders need to do to sort of be ready to hear these messages as well, right? And realize that their workplace may be great for certain folks, but not for everyone. When you mentioned the code switching and sort of the way that folks have to sort of conform to be able to, feel like they fit within the culture and the idea that culture add, or even I guess I'm sort of rambling here. But I'm just trying to think. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard because I think that there is, we spend a lot of time with the people we work with. You said something earlier about relationships and being able to relate to people. And it's something we've been coming up over and over and over again in the training that we've actually been designing around anti-oppression work in the workplace. And one of the important things is relational skills, being able to hold space for uncomfortable conversations and moments and just recognize that happens, being able to display empathy, reflecting, so taking a moment and, to just reflect on what's happening before moving. But the idea that we need to be able to relate to each other, and that those are core skills. And so if we can't do that, if we don't feel like we can relate to each other, it's going to be really hard to sort of do this work. So to answer your question is that I think that there is, a need for people to be able to show up where they are, but there's a lot of work, right, that an organization has to do. And it's not just, we want people not just to be able to say, like, this is a place where you can bring your full self to work, and not actually look at, have we actually created the conditions for which people can do this? I wonder more and more as we hear about the acronyms changing, DEIB, that belonging part is really sort of what we're talking about or what we're striving for. And we know that the desire to belong is like, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's pretty base, right? So if that's what we're looking for, if we're truly looking at creating a place where people can bring them full selves to work, then we need to look at, like, belonging and really interrogate that part of the work that we're doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that last part about the different language changing is super salient right now because we have so many acronyms that are coming about. And I think language is a very important part, even when we talk about empathy. What does that look like? And I think we kind of make this really big goal of bringing your full self to work and a really big goal of being vulnerable, but we're not creating those points of entry. And we have to take into cultural context when we even consider some of these words, like what cultural humility looks like, what empathy looks like in the workplace, and starting to have conversations about that. One, opens our eyes to different vantage points, different perspectives and cultural context, but two, gives us like a baseline of where we're starting from. And then also something I thought about in the work that I do pertaining to your last question about the racial component of this is boundaries are very important. They're important in general, but they're very important for specifically folks of color or marginalized populations in the workplace. And something that I like to infuse in the DEI work that I do is this mental wellness, techniques and practices, and establishing boundaries is very important. Understanding, what are some tools and language that I can use to draw a line if and when I'm feeling like I'm sharing too much or I don't want to contribute further. And that's totally okay. But just giving people the opportunity, like you would in any relationship, platonic, romantic, to navigate, this is how much I'm going to share. This is what it looks like to share. This is why it's hard for me. This is why, or this is what I need to fully contribute in this space. I think just granting space, time, empathy, vulnerability for those conversations to be had is super important and really salient for folks to feel like they belong. So thank you for bringing up that point.
Yeah, and it makes me think of going to go down this path a little bit about belonging, and if really what we're trying to get at when we say we want people to be able to bring their full selves to work, we want people to feel like they belong. I really like that point about boundaries. I mean, I think sometimes we think that this is like a utopian place where we're all just like playing ping pong and drinking beers at the workplace, but that's not necessarily it. It's about creating boundaries and the ability for people to raise concerns when they need to be able to celebrate certain things if that's what it looks like. But it's not, doesn't mean the sort of utopian, we're all like buds hanging out together. There is a model, or there's different ways, I guess, that this could be expressed. But I think sometimes it gets sort of that we have sort of a mental model that may not be exactly what it is. And you're talking about, I can bring my full self to work, and this is what it looks like for me, and sort of sharing with folks what that looks like, and creating boundaries, which I think is a really interesting point as well. I want to just cap off our conversation here by giving you the last word. There's a lot, I think, that we could sort of talk about in this topic, and we could definitely spend more than our time here doing this. But I'm wondering, what is one key thing that you'd like our listeners to take away from our conversation today? Something to sort of leave them thinking about.
It's a quote actually by Audre Lorde that I love. And it is, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. And I love this quote for so many reasons. When we do DEIB ideas work, it's really important that we look at the humanity of folks, because that's what essentially we're getting to. And whatever way that might look like for you, consider that of another person. And so engaging in mutuality, cultural humility, vulnerability, and empathy is an act of self-awareness, self-care, and also empathy and compassion toward and for other people. And so I would say definitely that. And that this is a skill that takes time. This is not something that can be done overnight, but it starts with the relational building small efforts that are embodied, that are exemplified, and that are modeled by leadership and organizational members. So I would definitely say that for sure.
I'm glad I gave you the last word. And for those who are interested in sort of learning more about your work and keeping up with you, where can they find you?
Yes, great question. So deepish.com, and that's DEEP-ISH.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn, Ymani Hawkins, YMANI HAWKINS. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ymani. And as always, if you have any of your own questions, or if you would like to be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Thank you, Ymani. It was so great to have you on. Until next time, I'm Dr. Melissa Horne, and this is Just One Q.